There's a supply manifest for a deep-sea drilling rig in the North Atlantic that lists 19 men leaving for a 2-week rotation. The manifest for the return trip lists 18. The company explained the difference in one line. One worker lost overboard, weather a factor. But the rig's own weather log for that night records a flat sea, winds under 10 knots. 18 men came back who would not talk about the nights before that one went into the water. Until one of them talked anyway, years later, once the contracts had expired and the company had been swallowed by a larger one that no longer cared. This is what he said circled the rig for 3 nights before it took Danny Okafor off the lower deck, what the instruments recorded, and what a multinational energy corporation spent a great deal of money making certain the world would never see. Start with the man who told it, because the strange thing is how little he wanted to be believed. Tom Reyes was the rig's night shift crane operator, 22 years on platforms across the North Sea and the Atlantic and the Gulf, a man who described himself flatly as someone who did not scare and did not embellish. He never sold the story. He told it once on the record to a maritime safety researcher, and asked that his name be withheld until after he was gone. He is gone now. And what he left behind is not a monster tale. It is the account of a man who watched something happen, was ordered to forget it, and could not. Hold on to Reyes, because the whole of this comes down to one question. What makes a hard, unshakable man break a silence? He was paid to keep, decades after the money stopped mattering. The rig is the second thing you need to understand, because the place is why this was possible and why it stayed buried. It was a deep water drilling platform anchored over one of the deep basins of the North Atlantic, where the shelf has already fallen away and the seabed sits far below in cold, black, barely charted water. A rig like that is a small industrial city welded to the top of the ocean, standing on legs that reach down hundreds of feet, watching itself with dozens of cameras and a full suite of sonar because a single missed fault can kill everyone aboard. Those instruments are not there to look for anything living. They watch the structure, which means that when something came up out of that basin on a calm night, it swam directly into a system built to notice everything and imagine nothing. The rig was not hunting a monster, it was simply, always, watching. And on the first of those 3 nights, at a depth where nothing that large was supposed to be, the watching system saw something watch back. It began as a fault. Just after 2 in the morning, the sonar monitoring the rig's submerged structure threw an alert, a large return close to one of the support legs. At a depth of around 300 feet, the operator logged it as a malfunction and reset the system, because the alternative was absurd. The return was the size of the equipment modules on the deck above him, a single solid mass, and nothing that size lived in that water. The system came back up. The return was still there, and it was moving, not drifting, not with the current, but tracing a slow, deliberate circle around the base of the rig, holding its depth, holding its distance, the way a thing circles something it is deciding about. Keep that word, deciding, because Reyes used it carefully, like a man who understood exactly what he was implying and meant to imply it anyway. For the rest of that first night it circled, and the men awake argued about what it was. A whale was the answer they wanted, and it did not survive the data. Whales surfaced to breathe, this did not. Whales moved through, this stayed, orbiting the rig for hours at a depth and a size no whale matched. By dawn it was gone, and the men who had watched it did the thing men do with something they cannot explain. They told themselves it was an instrument error, left it out of the written report, and waited to see if it came back. This is the first quiet mechanism of how a thing like this stays hidden. It is not always a corporation that buries the truth first. Sometimes the men who saw it bury it themselves, because the truth is too large to carry and too strange to say out loud. And that reluctance is exactly the soil a cover-up needs to grow in. It came back the second night, and this time it did not stay at 300 feet. The sonar caught it rising just after midnight, and the crew watched the depth number climb the way you watch a number you desperately want to stop. 300 feet, 250, 200. As it rose, it tightened its circle, drawing in toward the legs, until at around 150 feet the underwater structural cameras caught it crossing their light. Reyes was in the control room when the image came up, and what he described was worse for being partial. A vast dark shape crossing the frame, unhurried, filling the whole width of the view and continuing past both edges, so that the men were not looking at a creature but at a section of one. a piece of something whose full length they could only guess from how long it took to pass. It did not react to the lights. It moved through the legs of a structure built to survive an Atlantic hurricane as though it were a formation of rock it had swum past for 100 years. Then it descended, and the sonar tracked it going 400 feet, 600, gone, and the control room sat in silence because there was no version of the boring explanation left to reach for. And here is where the corporation enters, because by the morning after the second night, someone on shore knew. The rig had reported the anomaly up the chain, and the response that came back down was the first sign this was not new. The crew were instructed in writing to log the contacts as biological interference and take no further action. No investigation, no warning to the men working the lower decks. Reyes said it was that instruction, more than the thing on the sonar, that told him something was deeply wrong because you do not have a pre-written category called biological interference, and a procedure for filing it as nothing unless this has happened before and someone above the level of that rig already knew exactly what it was and had already decided the men on the platform were not worth the cost of stopping work. Sit with that, because it is the moral center of this account. The thing in the water was not the villain of the story Reyes told. The villain was the decision, made in an office by people who would never set foot on that rig, that the men on it could be left in the water with it rather than lose 2 days of drilling. Which brings the third night, and Danny Okafor. Danny Okafor was 26, on his fourth rotation, a roustabout on the lower deck. By every account the youngest and most liked man on the crew. He was not told what had been circling the rig for 2 nights, because the men who knew had been ordered to write it down as nothing, and an order like that seals mouths even among men who want to warn a friend. On the third night it came back fast and committed, and the first many of the crew knew of it was the sound. A deep structural boom through the legs, felt in the deck plates as something enormous struck a support from below. The lower deck lights failed. In the dark, with the platform ringing like a struck bell, Danny Okafor was at the lower rail. And then the water alongside rose, not a wave, a surge, the whole black surface lifting as something vast passed beneath it. And when the emergency lights came up, the rail was empty. The search lasted until dawn and found nothing. Not a body, not a trace, in a flat, calm sea because the thing that took him had not left anything to find. It had done what it came up 3 nights running to do, and then it had gone back down into the basin and it did not come back. The exciting answer is a surviving Megalodon, and it has to be set aside honestly because the honest version is the one that should frighten you. The fossil record puts that animal's extinction at around 3.5 million years ago, and the textbook calls it a warm water, shallow coast hunter, which on paper rules out a cold North Atlantic basin entirely. But that model rests on a single assumption, that the animal lived where its remains are found. Its fossils settle onto the seafloor and we recover them from shallow, surveyed water for one reason, because the deep ocean floor, the cold basins where this thing was tracked, has essentially never been sampled. We have better maps of Mars than of our own abyss. If a population had followed the cooling water and the deep prey down off the shelf into the basins as the surface oceans changed, their remains would rest on a bottom no survey has ever touched, and we would confidently call the animal extinct because we had never once looked in the place it went. Whatever circled that rig for 3 nights was larger than any shark science recognizes, moved through cold, deep water with the ease of an animal in its own home, and registered on 2 separate instruments as a single solid mass. We do not have to name it to understand that the men on that platform were sharing the ocean with something the textbooks swear cannot exist. And that is precisely why the cover-up is the strongest evidence in this account, because a cover-up is a confession. Think about what the company did. It did not investigate the death of a young worker, it did not warn the other rigs, it classified the sonar records, wrote Danny Okafor's death into the file as a man lost overboard in weather. Its own logs prove was calm, moved the men who saw it onto separate contracts around the world so they could not compare accounts, and bound them with agreements that outlived their careers. You do not do any of that over a whale. The scale of the concealment is the exact measure of what there was to conceal, and it means people with far more information than we will ever have looked at what happened, understood exactly what it was, and decided the safest thing a corporation could do was make certain it had never happened. The deletion is not the thing hiding the story. The deletion is the story, and it means this has almost certainly happened elsewhere on other rigs, over other basins, filed each time under weather and equipment failure. We know any of this only because Tom Reyes, 20 years later, decided a signed agreement mattered less than the memory of a 26-year-old who went into the water because no one was allowed to warn him. He never had proof. He had an account, and the one detail no company lawyer could edit out of the world. A supply manifest that took 19 men out and brought 18 back, and an official cause of death contradicted by the company's own weather log. It was never going to be enough to convict anyone, but it was enough for one old man to refuse to take the silence to his grave, and that refusal is the only reason the basin under that rig is anything more than an empty stretch of the North Atlantic on a chart. So we are left where Reyes was left, a rig standing over a deep, cold basin no survey has ever mapped. 3 nights of something the size of the rig's own modules circling in the dark, rising, learning the structure. A young man taken off a lower deck on a flat, calm sea, and a corporation that moved faster to hide it than it ever moved to understand it. The rig was scrapped years ago. The basin it stood over is still there, still cold, still black, still uncharted on every map that matters. And whatever came up out of it on those 3 nights, patient, enormous, entirely unbothered by the city of steel we had built in its water, is still down there, in the dark, below the reach of every instrument we own, in the one part of the ocean we have decided, officially, contains nothing at all. If you have ever been out on deep water and felt something you could not explain, a shape too large, a shadow that passed beneath the hull, a pull too strong to be real, tell me where you were in the comments. And subscribe to the Water Files, because the deep has not finished giving up what it hides. It has barely started.